Our world lead now, an international murder mystery pitting the U.S. against its key ally, Saudi Arabia. Turkish officials suggesting that Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman dispatched a hit squad to execute and then dismember Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi, according to the New York Times. The prominent critic of the Saudi regime vanished 9 days ago after entering the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, Turkey, to obtain a wedding document. Saudi Arabia has vehemently denied any involvement in the disappearance. The Trump administration, of course, has close ties with Saudi leadership, including the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner. Sources telling CNN that bin Salman reached out to Kushner directly this week to deny any involvement in the incident. Of course, it's not just this White House. Administrations going back years, if not decades, have been simply unable to hold the oil-rich kingdom to account in any way. That includes the fact that 15 of the 19 September 11th hijackers were Saudis, the country's long history of funneling money to terrorist organizations. Earlier this year, dropping a U.S.-made bomb on a school bus containing Yemeni children. CNN senior international correspondent Arwa Damon joins me now live from Istanbul, Turkey. And Arwa, to date, the Saudi government has produced no evidence that Khashoggi left the consulate alive.
No, they haven't, and that's why there's so many questions regarding what Saudi's role actually was in all of this and what did transpire in the building, the Saudi consulate that is behind me. Now, the U.S., the Saudi ambassador to the U.S. is, according to the U.S. State Department, on his way back home to the kingdom as this mystery seems to be deepening. This is Jamal Khashoggi captured on closed-circuit cameras, stepping into what Turkish authorities believe was a death trap. The Saudi consulate in Istanbul now shrouded in mystery as the last place the royal insider turned critic was seen alive. Officials from Saudi Arabia adamantly deny foul play, but a Turkish official says police believe this is the scene of premeditated murder. Beginning around 3:30 a.m. the day of Khashoggi's disappearance, Turkish authorities say a group of Saudi men flew into Istanbul on a private jet and checked into a hotel near the consulate. An hour and 52 minutes after Khashoggi entered the consulate that afternoon, security footage leaked to Turkish media shows a caravan of black-tinted consulate vehicles departing. Their destination? The nearby consulate residence, where the largest van in the group disappears within. Whether Khashoggi was inside one of the vehicles is unknown. A Turkish official tells the New York Times Saudi agents had dismembered his body with a bone saw they brought for the purpose, but declined to show evidence. Back at the consulate, Khashoggi's fiancée, who had been waiting for him outside, is seen pacing near the entrance, her concern rising as the hours passed. So who ordered this alleged assassination? An American official tells CNN the U.S. has intercepts of Saudi officials discussing a plan to lure Khashoggi back to Saudi Arabia to detain him. A confrontation at the consulate in Turkey may have been a backup plan. The U.S. official says such a plot would need the approval of Saudi's crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman, or MBS.
Thank you very much.
Someone warmly embraced by the Trump administration. Earlier this week, MBS placed a direct call to President Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, according to a person familiar with the call, and denied any involvement in Khashoggi's disappearance. Kushner took an unannounced trip to Saudi Arabia in 2017 to meet with the young prince. Months later, MBS reportedly boasted that Kushner was, quote, in his pocket, which bin Salman denied. Now, as the U.S. mulls an investigation into Khashoggi's fate, senators are calling for answers.
The intel points directly at them and them thinking about this in advance. The administration will have to pay attention to that.
And President Trump is declining to point fingers.
We're looking at it very strongly. We'll be having a report out soon. We're working with Turkey. We're working with Saudi Arabia. What happened is a terrible thing, assuming that happened. I mean, maybe we'll be pleasantly surprised, but somehow I tend to doubt it.
And Jake, you'll remember that a few days ago, the Turks asked and received permission to actually search and conduct their own investigation in the Saudi consulate and at the consul general's home. But then the Saudis asked that it be postponed. This is obviously a very highly politically charged investigation. And now we heard from a Turkish presidential spokesman that there will be a joint working group established between Turkey and Saudi Arabia.
Oh, good, a working group. Arwa Damon, thank you so much. Appreciate it. Let's talk about it with the experts. And Bill, let me remind people what President Trump said just a few minutes ago when asked about what kind of punishment the U.S. could met out towards Saudi Arabia, including suspending arms sales.
I would not be in favor of stopping a country from spending $110 billion, which is an all-time record, and letting Russia have that money and letting China have that money. So what good does that do us?
What do you think?
The Saudis over the decades have bought an awful lot of influence in Washington and in America. Now, there were realpolitik reasons for going along with policies and with a regime that we don't like in so many ways, that exported terrorism, that has horrible human rights record at home, and so forth. But the main reason was oil, obviously. But we don't depend on Saudi oil today. And the world actually depends less on Saudi oil than it used to. And what's the other reason? They're such a great stalwart ally against Iran. I don't buy that. What are they really doing against Iran? They're fighting a horrible war in Yemen, which may be, I mean, we might be sort of on their side, but they're doing it in a way that's antagonizing everyone there and elsewhere. So I think maybe, I mean, I've been sort of anti-Saudi vaguely for 25, 30 years, but I finally feel that this might be an occasion. It's a horrible, tragic moment where people might reconsider the whole relationship.
And let's not forget, in 2015, President Trump, then candidate Trump, talked about his feelings towards Saudi Arabia. There happened to be other influences in his mind and his pocket. Take a listen.
Saudi Arabia, and I get along great with all of them. They buy apartments from me, they spend $40 million, $50 million. Am I supposed to dislike them? I like them very much.
I mean, this is one of the reasons why people thought President Trump should divest any of his holdings, because obviously, if he depends $50 million a year from the Saudis, it could influence his view of foreign policy.
Absolutely, and you still have those questions lingering. In all fairness, he also has talked about China, for example, being a landlord to one of the Chinese banks in New York. But the real issue here is that the president and Jared Kushner have really hinged so much of their policy on MBS and on the new Saudi Arabia that is emerging under this the Crown Prince, rather. And so this is throwing all of that into question. And it's not just the alignment between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia in terms of confronting Iranian influence, which is both the president's policy, Jared Kushner's policy, John Bolton's policy, the national security advisor, but it also affects another key priority for Jared Kushner and the president, which is Israeli-Palestinian peace. When you ask administration officials what the one difference is as far as why they can now perhaps solve this decades-long crisis, they talk about Saudi Arabia. They talk about the emerging alignment between Saudi Arabia and Israel and other key players in the region. And so there's more at stake here than simply the U.S.-Saudi relationship. There's really all of these regional dynamics at play. And it remains to be seen whether this administration is going to determine that what happened to this journalist is enough to let all of that unravel.
Although it seems as though, at least with members of the Senate, that Saudi Arabia may have crossed a line here. They're now pushing for an investigation to find out if there should be sanctions against Saudi Arabia for this alleged murder. Take a listen to the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Bob Corker of Tennessee.
My instincts say that there's no question the Saudi government did this, and my instincts say that they murdered him. It will hugely undermine that relationship, at least with Congress, and the administration will have to pay attention to that.
Now, you served in the Obama White House, the Obama State Department. What do you think the Senate should do? What should the White House do?
Well, the White House certainly should have spoken out earlier than it did, and part of this Saudi ability to get away with murder is because of the White House's own crackdown on media. For example, the White House does not release any of the record statements of conversations between foreign leaders. We don't even have daily press briefings anymore. And we find out through the president's offhand comment that Jared Kushner had already spoken with MDS a couple of days ago. We don't know what the content of that conversation was, but I surmise, given their close crown prince to crown prince relationship, that it was more likely about how do they cover each other and help each other out than it was about using U.S. power to hold Saudi Arabia accountable for any of its human rights violations. We are now looking at the Senate having to take up that role of diplomacy that has been abdicated by the Trump White House.
And the letter that triggered this investigation inside the White House from Congress was signed not only by Bob Corker, but also by the man, Jim Risch, who would take Bob Corker's place should Republicans retain control of the Senate next year. Also, Bob Menendez was a co-signer on that letter.
Every member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee except for Rand Paul. Right.
So, yes. And the unlikely occasion that Rand Paul would be heading up the Foreign Relations Committee, that's not going to happen. Either way, this is something that's not going to go away, and one of the few things that the midterms aren't going to solve for the president.
And the act that's being invoked in the letter that Jackie mentions is the Magnitsky Act, which is named after a Russian journalist killed by Putin. So maybe we should have, get serious about not coddling dictators of various kinds and standing up for human rights, especially in this case, a man who is a permanent resident, a legal resident of the United States, I believe. I think his children are U.S. citizens, who was living here, who goes to an embassy and an ally, a NATO ally in Turkey, and the Saudis decide to abduct him or whatever they decide to do, and they end up killing him, apparently. I mean, that's pretty terrible.
And we can't continue to outsource U.S. power to places like Turkey, for example, which has its own extreme record of violations against journalism. At the height of Erdogan taking control, 160 journalists detained, more than 150 media outlets shut down. We can't be relying on a country like that to be standing up for the rights of journalists to be covering these types of regimes. And also, they're problematic in general. This is why we have U.S. intelligence services. We're hearing about all of these reports because of the resourcefulness of American reporters. The White House could easily have turned on some of our assets and intel sources in the region to get to the bottom of what's been happening with Khashoggi.
But Jackie, am I overly skeptical, overly cynical even? Because I think 15 of the 19 9/11 hijackers were Saudis. Al-Qaeda was partly funded by Saudis. We didn't do anything then. Why are we going to do something about this journalist who's not even an American citizen?
It's a really good question. The Saudis do wield a lot of power, have and continue to, in the U.S. government. Let's not forget, it was the first place Trump went abroad.
The very first stop.
The very first stop was Saudi Arabia. So it's hard for me to think, and I also don't mean to be cynical, that this is really going to be the thing that really alters U.S. policy towards Saudi Arabia.
All right, everyone stick around. We've got more to talk about because, of course, Kanye went to the White House today.